That's pretty good. Are we good to go? Fareed? Okay, good evening, and thank you for tuning in to Labor Shift, the best 60 minutes on the clock. I'm Reverend Terry Melvin, president of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and your host for Labor Shift. I want to welcome you to our show tonight. When we started Labor Shift, our focus was to accomplish two things, bringing you information on important subjects and bringing you the Black perspective on current issues. I think we've done a good job on this the past 3 episodes, but for this episode, we wanted to change it up a bit. We didn't just want to have the Black perspective on things, we wanted the young Black perspective. Right now, our young people have taken to the streets and have galvanized this nation to make change at a pace we haven't seen in decades. Monuments to slave owners have been torn down. New policing policies have been implemented on the local level all over this country. Every state in the nation rose up proudly to proclaim Black Lives Matter. This is historic. This is monumental. This is the change that is built on the legacy of the civil rights movement, but is being spearheaded by this younger generation. So tonight, we wanted to do something a little different. We want to hear from these young folks. We want to get their personal perspective of this moment and hopefully some insight on how we, the older generation, can do things differently to support them. We entitled this episode, Your Sons and Your Daughters Are Beyond Your Command, Thank Goodness. The full quote is actually, don't criticize what you don't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. We took this quote from the Bob Dylan song, The Times They Are A-Changing. And brothers and sisters, let me say, the times are a-changing. And in this true CBTU fashion, we too are changing with the times. Not just the focus of the show, but how we run the show. See, I'm used to doing things a certain way. I've been trained, like my mentors, like Bill Lucy, to operate in a certain fashion. But tonight, I want to break things up a little bit. Tonight, I want to approach this episode in a different way. Instead of me introducing our guests, I want them to introduce themselves. Let them tell us who they are. Let them tell us about this moment. Let them inform us of this movement happening before our eyes, and tell us how we can be involved instead of how we can get them involved. So I want to start with Mercedes Fulbright. This is a bad sister with more titles than vowels in her name. Mercedes, can you please introduce yourself to the audience and let them know who you are, where you're from, and most importantly, how you got started in the movement? Mercedes?
Hi, Mercedes Fulbright here. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I am based in Dallas, Texas, professional job by day, which merges with my community work as well, is Texas Working Families Party. We're a grassroots political party that is trying to break up the two-party system and build a base of working class folks across the country, and specifically for me in the state of Texas. I'm the organizing director with them. And as well as a member of BYP 100, the Dallas chapter. We are one of 10 city chapters across the national organization of Black activists and organizers, building justice and liberation for all Black people through a Black queer feminist lens. I do a ton of work around police brutality, around defunding the police, around electoral justice. And I came into this work actually through college. First time that President Barack Obama ran for office, I was a freshman in 2008 and was politicized not only by his race, but the voter suppression that followed after his election in 2009 locally in Texas. That moment where I was turned away from the polls actually forced me to question power and political structures and systems. And from there, I joined the NAACP through the Youth and College Division and moved through the ranks of that and was on the national board. And then continued my activism post-college through a number of electoral work that I did in my city in Dallas with city council and school board races. And then had a really great opportunity to move to DC and work for then at the time Mayor Andrew Gillum for Young People For, and learned much about public policy and progressive politics, and moved back home and continued my work there. I had the opportunity to join the BYP chapter while I was living in DC, and then most recently helped to co-found the Dallas chapter that we have in our city, which is exciting. We're trying to build a Black radical left political home for young Black people. And so as we continue to push this work around divesting from the police and investing in community, we're seeing this cultural shift that is allowing more young Black folks, especially Generation Z, and even millennials who may have never organized or ever been to a protest, coming into our movement, coming into our work. And so it's an exciting time to be an organizer, to be an activist, and to continue to build this long, local, strong movement that we have, not only in the state of Texas, but in the city of Dallas.
Wow. Wow, that's awesome. What a resume. I mean, I introduced you guys as the young folks, but that resume will compare to a lot of seasoned folks that have been in the movement for quite some time and haven't done the things that you've been able to do in your short time. I am like, my mind is being blown right now at just what is going to happen in the future with the work that you've already started. Next on our panel is our brother, Larry Williams. Larry, can you tell our viewing audience who you are, how you got involved, and what organizations you're with at this time? Larry?
Hey, yeah. Nice to meet everyone. And thank you for welcoming me to this conversation, to the CBTU community. I may be familiar to some of you because I've done some work with CBTU in the past. I started off in the labor movement about 10 years ago, working at the Teamsters Union as the labor organizing, technical labor organizing person lead. And, you know, I started union-based as a solution to the need for digital presence in the labor movement. You know, the labor movement doesn't have a very good presence on the internet as a whole. And union-based is the first social networking platform for unions and union members. And then I later became the labor coordinator at the Sierra Club, the largest nonprofit environmental organization in the country, and also started Progressive Workers Union, which is a union for workers who work at nonprofits, environmental organizations, and unions, and has been growing ever since. I'm not the president of PWU anymore, but I still support the union, and I still run union-based and do work around just transition around the country.
Thanks a lot, Larry. Good to see a young brother wear so many hats with experience under his belt. And finally, our last on the panel is a distinguished scholar and educator. She's an educator, historian, an activist, and organizer. But let me shut up. Old habits are hard to break. Sister Kim Coleman, will you do me the honor of telling the people about yourself, where you came from, how you got started, and what you're up to now?
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much again for having me in the conversation itself. So I'm a storyteller and a historian, and I'm locally based in New Orleans. I was born and raised here. And I got into storytelling specifically in the museum set through grad school when I got my MA in Museum Studies from Southern University, where I went back to become a professor of museum and communities. And what I've done for the last 6 years is develop storytelling around anti-racist work, largely in provoking or inputting the Black narrative into American history, especially around political Blackness, what it means to be Black through the lens of a New Orleanian from the 18th and 19th century through the Black Creole community and how they were unfortunately devastated following 1865. And then through art history, making sure that people understand the importance of controlling your own imagery, especially when imagery was mass media. So this is pre-20th century Black art and how it goes around. As a museum professional, I've been a part of NOAC, which is the New Orleans Arts Coalition, which works to fund or provide equitable funding for Black arts institutions in the city of New Orleans, considering that there are only currently 3 major Black art institutions that are recognized by the city in terms of marketing, but not economically. And so we wanted to actually branch that out in a city that has about a 57% African representation or African descendant representation, and about 20 different Black small arts organizations that talk about different modes of the Black experience, going out through New Orleans history and New Orleans culture, trying to make sure that they get adequate funding on that end.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. I am truly humbled to be here with the 3 of you today, and I want you to know that. But today I just want to have a family conversation, if you will. All of you are experienced with deep insight and personal expertise on what is going on in this country at this moment in time. All of you have nuggets of wisdom and information that I think we all need to hear. And most importantly, all of you come from different arenas in the movement. We have grassroots organizing, scholarly intellectuals, tech-savvy environmentalists, men, women, gay, straight. While you are all young, you're not all the same. And we want to highlight this difference because I believe it shows how this movement truly encompasses all demographics. So the plan is that I'm going to lob a few questions out for you to answer in no order. We just want to have some dialogue. The panelists, you are free tonight to respond as you see fit, freed up to chime in when a thought comes to you based on what somebody says, freed up to add to the conversation, freed up to speak truth to this moment. Before I ask the first question, I want to give some context. The people have taken to the streets. The death of George Floyd, mixed with high unemployment rates and dash of stir crazy, has created the perfect brew for people to protest en masse. As an age labor leader, I see this as the perfect storm. The intersection of strong winds, left unabated, intersecting at the right time, at the right moment to wreak havoc on the status quo that has profited too long by our exploitation. I see this as an organizing opportunity, but that's how I've been trained to see it. What I'm wondering is, how do you all see this moment? As a quote unquote millennial, what is your personal perspective of what is happening around you? Who wants to take the first shot?
Anyone?
I guess you are, Kim.
I know, I guess it's me. So what I've been told recently is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it has a very specific rhythm and it rhymes. And so in this moment, all I can see is the history behind how this moment got to be. Like the last large moment that I can even associate with this happened during the Vietnam War. And so anytime during great animosity, great tension, MLK described it as schizophrenia, right? You have this amazing opportunity to enact change and kind of reimagine your existence. So when it comes to the Vietnam War, you also had the Black Power movement that literally happened slightly before that and then kind of got usurped into that wave, which became this massive thing. And here we have COVID-19 as a backdrop, massive unemployment, but also what it's done, what COVID-19 did specifically was lift our rose-colored glasses, where every person in this country recognized how inequitable this country actually was. There was something very specific that happened in the first month of a lockdown, where in Michigan, there were, after 4 weeks, had protests And one of these guys, I'm never gonna forget it, he's a white guy, he's in a van. And he was talking about economic disruption, that someone he knew blew through his entire life savings in 4 weeks. That means something is fundamentally wrong with the system. If it only took you 2 paychecks to run through your entire life savings. So you're having this economic upheaval where white people are finally understanding that they're being treated inequitably in what was supposed to be their system. And then in the minute of their depression, you also see death, this violence of George Floyd. And then following George Floyd, you have Breonna Taylor, then you have Tony Day, then you have Elijah McClain. All of these people are dying, and everyone is now collectively in their house looking at each other and realizing that none of this is perfect. None of this is great again. None of this was ever great. An idle brain is amazing. It allows you to come up with all types of things. It allows you to research all types of things. Something that I've been fascinated with as a historian is watching white individuals, in particularly, discover history that they never knew existed. The biggest one being Juneteenth, and watching it kind of unfold in real time. And then them beginning to question what it is that they've been educated about and how they've been educated about it. And then recognizing that in every avenue of their existence, there lives an idea of race supremacy. One built solely to keep up the 1%, who during this 4 months where this guy has ran through his life savings has made $528 billion. So I particularly think this moment is not just about George Floyd. I actually think it's not just about police brutality. This is about the fact that America is burning. And it's up to us at this point in time to reimagine it like we reimagined it several times before. If we don't change it now, in this moment, if we are not revolutionary now, if we are not rapid now, what we're basically saying to the rest of the world is, you might as well just leave America alone. She's dying.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you. Larry or Mercedes?
That was really great, Kimberly. Thank you for that. I want to just add that with this pandemic, one, we are seeing, I think, the way I would say this is we're seeing how this country has won for centuries, has been gaslighting communities of color, especially Black folks, and acknowledging that we are in this emotionally abusive relationship with this country as it relates to the things that Black people, brown folks, Indigenous folks have been demanding and asking for years when it comes to investments in their lives. And folks saying that we don't have the money or the resources or means to take care of you, and to then go through a pandemic all at the same time, where folks have been demanding that they get checks, even if they don't have a job. And then magically we are getting $2,000 in our bank account as if this money was somehow somewhere in a bank that you could access, right? We're talking about exposing a number of inequities in the infrastructure that is this federal government, right? In our local and state government. And people starting to reckon, especially those that are privileged, reckon with these inequities that folks have been calling out for decades, especially as oppressed and marginalized communities. And so to Kimberly's point around having this idle mind, like, we're all having to actually pay attention to what's happening in our communities, to our neighbors, across cities, right? And in this moment, not only are we seeing police brutality for its ugly head, as we've always seen as Black folks, but folks who have either never experienced this sort of racism, this sort of violence, are now starting to question, like, is this a system that we should continue to invest in, especially when you have over 40 million people unemployed. And for whatever reason, we find billions and billions of dollars to not only arm police, but arm our military. And that money could actually take care of the very folks who keep this country running. This is a labor forum, right? Like, what's happening in this pandemic is directly hitting the very folks that you all are working with and represent. And we're at this place now where folks are, despair and grief we've just hit the boiling point at this point, right? And so when folks are questioning, I've had this question come to me a lot, when folks are like, is this appropriate for us to be protesting during a pandemic? There are multiple pandemics that Black people have been experiencing. And so for us, when we talk about taking to the streets and trying to practice social distancing at the same time, we understand the pandemic to be police violence and terror. We understand the pandemic to be racial terror on top of an invisible enemy that is coronavirus, right? But we also folks are starting to also have a critical lens around how this coronavirus came to be, right? Like this is a extraction of people who have been pushed out of communities, who have been pushed to rural parts of the world, to where they're having to interact with wild animals, and then you're having to get this coronavirus. If folks don't know like the origins of the coronavirus, that's something that people should spend time focusing on, because it's rooted in capitalism, right? And it's rooted in the fact that you have folks who are being pushed to the margins of this world, not this country, of this world, and having to interact with wild animals because they believe that to continue to extract from people's labors, that you don't actually have to pay people well, right? And if you don't pay people well, they live in poverty. And when you live in poverty, you're taking on survival tactics in some moments where you're eating wild bats. And then next thing you know, you have folks who are traveling to these rural parts of the world, getting on planes, spreading this virus, and then it's being placed on Black people in ways that is exposing health inequities in our communities, that's exposing poverty in our community, that's exposing the lack of access that we have to healthcare, right? And people still continue to gaslight the Black community and saying it's our fault that we're dying at high rates. And so what I know to be true is that our folks are fed up, right? And that's why I continue to see people taking to the streets. And they're willing to risk their health, to risk their lives for the justice of not only Black people, but all people at this point. And I think it's important for people to see that and to reckon with that, especially those who have access to privilege and those who have access to power. They're asking for us to be peaceful, but what they're acknowledging and realizing is that they've been looting and stealing from us for years, for decades, and our folks are tired. We are so tired, and we're so tired to the point where we're willing to contract a virus to make it known and to be seen in this moment. And I think it's beautiful. And I think this is a real opportunity for us to name all the radical demands that we have as a people, because many of the things that folks call radical are actually basic human rights, right? And all we're asking is for this country, these county government systems, to divest from an institution that historically has been rooted in anti-Black and has been rooted in capitalistic exploitative forces around extracting profits from our communities, right? And so for us, I'm excited to know that, the uprisings are still happening. I'm excited to know that folks are taking to not only the streets, but online in different ways where their activism is being heightened. But that this is a moment that I think will actually last. Like protest moments don't last, but I think the consciousness shift will last, and we will start to feel what it means for an entire country, an entire world to shift their understanding of what's happening or what's been happening to oppressed communities over centuries. And I think it's important for us to lean into that and to really sit with what's about to happen, I would say, over the next decade because of this moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mercedes. Larry?
Awesome. What Mercedes and Kimberly said, I think is super on point. I think I could just add a few points. I think that definitely the fact that we're all stuck in the house and have no distractions, there's no NFL, no MLB, no NHL, nothing to distract you from the reality of what's going on, is super helpful for the movement, because people like the three of us are, and also the folks who are hosting us, are always focused on the movement, right? What is the rest of the world and the people that we're trying to reach, what are they paying attention to? And we're always competing with so much. In this moment, those things are very light. Also, just looking at the beginning of, I think, where things really started to kick off, when coronavirus really started hitting the States in particular, since I think we're talking mainly in the context of the United States, there was massive layoffs, right? Some numbers as high as 25% of the population unemployed, particularly hitting Black and brown workers as usual. The other thing to identify is that frontline workers for the first time are the center of conversation: bus drivers, medics, people who deliver the trash, Instacart workers, Uber drivers, people who we rely on for everything, who are the center of the economy, who are people, a lot of them are members of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, finally became the center of conversation. But what's really happened, in my opinion, is that the flaws in these institutions, like Mercedes identified, is becoming laid bare, whether it's corporations, whether it's sports organizations, whether it's nonprofits or even unions. The fact that these institutions are not up to the challenge has become laid bare. Now, I say that not lightly, because I've spent the most of my career trying to promote unions, particularly people of color and brown people. But when you think about the history of the labor movement and its exclusion of Black and brown people, and the reason why you created CBTU, and the fact that, now all these organizations will come around and say we care about Black lives and Black lives matters. No, you don't. You really don't. For the NFL to come back and say that Kaepernick is right, and, well, they're not going to actually say that, but they identify the fact that he was, they were wrong to punish players for protests. It's just, I think, evident of the wave, right? And it's easy to post a hashtag, but what are you really doing? In terms of the labor movement, when I created Union Base, I did so with the understanding that Black and brown people, particularly Black women, are the people who are the quickest to organize, and the numbers show that. But we receive the highest punishment for doing so, and also we're less likely to be targeted for these organizing campaigns by unions. So I think when we're talking to CBTU, for those in the organization looking out, don't look at this as just a moment to say, how can we use these young people to gain power for our organization? More like, how can I step back and let young people step into my position? And frankly, how can I organize myself out of a job? How can I retire and put somebody else here? I was president of PW for 3 years. We got a landmark contract that is now being used as a standard for other nonprofit groups trying to organize. In particular, other unions are trying to use it. And, when it was at the height of its power, I stepped back and I didn't just dump it on their lap. I prepared that person. That person was standing next to me, fighting with me, and they knew what they were going to do. And then they took the ball and they ran it even further than I did. And it was a woman of color. And that person handed it back to another person of color. I don't see the nonprofit world doing that. I don't see the union movement doing that. Corporations definitely don't do that, because there's very few. I think they said 4 people who run a Fortune 500 companies at that level, at the leadership level. At the labor movement, even less. We've never had a Black AFL-CIO president. The last thing I want to say is that, the AFL-CIO was burned, the lobby was burned, which is a very sad thing given the history of what the AFL-CIO has done for the labor movement. But it's not surprising given the fact that I think people our age and younger have no idea what the AFL-CIO is. They have no idea what labor history is. And I don't completely blame the current labor leadership for doing that, but for that reason. But I think that we need to look at ourselves and say, why are we not relevant? Why, think about the fact that, we think of ourselves as so powerful, but we only represent a very small percentage of the working population. Yes, it is important. The labor movement is very important. But why is it that Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives and all these other organizations that are extremely active and out there risking their bodies and their lives don't think of the labor movement as the first place to go? It's because when they come around and say you need to kick out police unions, we give this very nuanced answer saying, well, police are workers, et cetera, et cetera. We're not taking this moment as an opportunity to stand next to those people who are building the real power. And because of that, honestly, I predict us completely missing the movement, missing the moment, and then it's going to pass us by and it's going to become even more relevant. So that's my view on things right now.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Larry. I just want to, before
I think, Mercedes, were you going to follow up?
I was just going to say thank you for touching on the police unions and labor. Like, this is a real moment, not only around the higher unemployment rate that's happening, but the fact that as we talk about divesting from police, that labor leaders need to step up and push police unions out of the unions, because they are not workers and they're not folks who actually stand on the right side of labor worker rights. They are the folks who actually protect the very people that we are striking and protesting. And so I think it's important that you name that. And I just wanted to double tap that, because we are, in a space with labor leaders. And I'm hopeful that conversation is happening, but we need a public a public solidarity with protesters and organizers right now who are pushing this work, because labor unions are definitely becoming more aggressive around their messaging and even on the ground as we talk about divesting from police, and to have labor support would be huge in this moment.
I just want to give a nuance, and I really appreciate that support. And I just want to say that, I don't want to broad brush labor, because I criticize people doing that all the time. The Writers Guild did try to push for the removal of police unions. And there's, a number of people talking about it, but nobody other than the Writers Guild really stepped out and took a strong position on that. And this conversation we had with Bill Fletcher, which got a lot of traction, he noted that, look, a lot of unions have police officers in their ranks. The Teamsters, AFSCME, which is federal workers, AFGE, more federal government workers. And so even if you kicked out the IUPA, the biggest federation of police union, biggest police union federation, a part of the AFL-CIO, you would still have a lot of unions that represent police officers, right? And then you have ICE, and then you have prison guards. So there's a lot of other police that are part of the union movement. And I think that a nuanced conversation should actually happen. The problem is it doesn't seem like that conversation is actually happening in an open way. So I just want to add that context.
Let me add something to make a correlation.
Jump in for a moment on this issue. I just can't let this go by when we're talking about the issue of police unions. Let's be careful not to throw a whole group, just like we don't want all Black folks thrown into one category or all white folks thrown into one category. All police unions are not the same. And, my fear and my pushback on this call to push all police unions out of existence is, I see this, sisters and brothers, as a slippery slope that we could give the right to come in and take collective bargaining rights for all of us. They came after the old story. They came after the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't fight. They came after the white folks. I wasn't white, so I didn't fight. They came after the women. I wasn't a woman, so I didn't fight. Then they came for me, and I was the only one left. Wasn't nobody left to fight for me. If we allow one segment, because of bad apples, and I'm not saying there ain't a bunch of them out there, a lot of them, but there's some good. I come from a family that had uncles and cousins that were long-term police officers, okay? And I know that there are good officers that believe in protecting and serving. I think we have to go back and deal with the systematic issues of racism and systemic racism that's in this country and deal with those laws that address that. I think we need to address the bad cops that are out there and the bad unions that are out there. And let me admit, as a union official for 40 years, that there are good and bad union officials, right? That we need to deal with, just like there's good and bad in every different workplace that you can even think of. So I just caution, and that's been my pushback since this issue has come up, to just throw all the police unions out. Well, if they say the police unions need to be thrown out, when the right comes up and says all public sector unions, because they work for the public good, people should not be able to unionize, what is our pushback? Well, yeah, they should. Why? Because everybody should have to collectively have a right to come together and speak against the employer, because they have all the resources. The boss has all the resources on their side. So I just have to push back as the old guy in the room, and I'm open up. I think.
So I do have a comment. And I'm going to respectfully disagree with you.
Oh,
and
please.
the reason why is because police unions, police officers uphold capitalism. They don't uphold people. They're not people-minded. They're to protect and serve property. So we're talking about aspects of our society where there are not public servants. They do not adhere to us. If they did, if I tell you I can't breathe, you get up, right? I pay your job. I basically should have, if we could interact with police the way we interact, or the way unions interact between employers and employees, then I would be like, okay, they could, because we can actually change their behavior. I am not of the belief that you can reform any of this. It must be torn down. And this is also very recent. I just got into the idea of the prison industrial complex and the abolition movement surrounding that, and surrounding abolishing the police itself. But the idea and why, so I'm going to use New Orleans as an example. New Orleans has horrible schools, has horrible housing, has horrible healthcare. Why is the city's budget, why is over 50% of the city's budget going to protecting the city instead of actively dealing with the things that affect criminality? People do not commit crimes if they have food, housing, gainful employment, right? They do not whatsoever. Human nature is very simple. When you put someone in survival mode, then they begin to act out in avenues of what we consider crime. And I don't necessarily believe that some of these things that we've criminalized should actually be criminal if we're going on the basis of how the right is now saying my body, my choice. That means if somebody smokes heroin, their body, their choice. If someone smokes weed, their body, their choice. If someone sells their body, their choice. But we've criminalized sex workers, we criminalized addicts, and particularly we did it when it was the 80s and the 90s, war on drugs, war on poverty. And now we've moved to where, oh, we have to rehabilitate them because now we understand that white kids are more likely to do those things. But they're the only people benefiting from it, right? Black people are only policed historically because of the value of their body. That's it. Think about when police historically existed, how they started as patty rollers. Think about when prisons become an industrial complex following Reconstruction, and you get convict lease systems. Think about when prisons expand their systems after integration and the deindustrialization of urbanized areas that now are transferred into ghettos, right? All of this is maintained specifically to subjugate Black and brown people, more so Black people than anyone else. I know a lot of good cops. My dad was a cop, but my dad was not put in place to protect me. Actually, 90% of their calls are welfare calls that should be regulated to social workers and other advocacy groups. But then that also goes into the fact that everything is racist. Social workers work in racist ways. Teachers work in racist ways. Medical professionals work in racist ways. And so a lot of this, I think, is the culmination of the fact that America has not dealt with this original sin. We're based on genocide, theft, rape, forced labor. And because of that, we can't move into an equitable system because we want to maintain the idea of a utopian capitalist nation in which you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I have a big issue with the way in which we're handling safety. And why do I need someone who's one, gonna come after the crime is committed to make me feel safe? What I actually need is to not live in a food desert. What I actually need is access to safe housing. What I actually need is my children to go to a school where I know they're learning the same things in New Orleans that they are in New York, that they are in Dallas, that they are in Seattle. These are the basics of what we are. And unfortunately, in this country, they've been looked at as a privilege when it's literally a human right. And for these police unions to uphold, did everyone see the NYPD held a large press conference in the middle of the protests with nothing but angry white men who were like holding up their badge, talking about, I'm proud to be a police officer. When we have just seen the day before a police officer ramming their car into protesters, when if you were actually put in to protect and serve me, you're protecting my First Amendment right. Instead, you are negating that completely because I'm going against the system that you uphold because you want money.
Well, let me just, I mean, as we, and I've listened to you, and let me just say, I think I agree with you on the point that what has to be done is the system needs to be changed. The laws need to be changed. I agree that we're under a system of institutionalized racism, that this country was built on institutionalized racism. And, me for one, I'm one that I'm tired of marching without a reason. I need to know that, and this is what I'm counting on you for, these young generation that's out there today, is how do we change the system from what it is now to what we envision it to be, which is a country that that's a country that believes in equity, not equality, because we're not at the same level to start out with. So how do we get a country that puts us all on an equal footing going forward and addresses those needs? I believe we've got to address the banking deserts. We've got to address the food deserts in our community. We've got to address the education deserts in our community. We do need to assess where the money is going in our community. I agree with that wholeheartedly, but how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be? Because I'm not willing to say, and you guys jump in, please, I'm not willing to say that if somebody raped my child, that I don't want somebody there to deal with it. I'm not willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So how do we get from where we are now, which is a broken system, which is built on racism, to a system that deals with those issues that you just brought up, that we all agree need to be dealt with? How do we get from here? How do we take this from a moment in time to a movement to something better?
President Melvin, I think you may have the wrong three people for that particular conversation, because this is three people who are talking about, and by the way, the movement for Black Lives and those groups are inhabited by people even younger than us. So I'm in my 30s, so I'm not exactly super young, right? But we're talking about defunding the police, reimagining something different in its place that is about rehabilitation and the management of harm. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be someone to handle instances of violence, but it would not be, men with guns that come from a white supremacist network, and use violence as their first means of resolving a situation. Police in the way that it exists now would not exist in the new world we're talking about. So I don't think, I personally can't have a conversation about, is it okay to have this type of chokehold or that type of chokehold? Like, reform is not my bag. You did mention Eric Garner. I mean, chokeholds have been illegal in New York for a long time. Tamir Rice had a toy gun. Breonna Taylor was in her crib. Like, in her house, there was a gentleman that was killed by a police officer who said she had the wrong apartment. It just gets ridiculous, right?
Right.
John Crawford was in a Walmart standing on a toy rifle. I mean, there's so many things that have nothing to do with the law. So I think, what people are rightly targeting is white supremacy as a system, as an endemic system. I think Kimberly laid it out really well, that there's a lot of historical connections to the way the police operate that I think deserves an even longer call. But in terms of police unions, I understand what you're saying about collective bargaining. And whenever we have these conversations, people tend to bring up the extreme. Oh, well, what if somebody gets raped? What if somebody gets shot? What if, they say we can't collectively bargain? Well, we use a scalpel for everything else. So why can't we use a scalpel for this? When it comes to police unions, it is a fact, and research has shown this, and I can share links, that police union contracts allow police officers to come back to the job after killing someone, to get their money back after having had to pay penance for those crimes. And a lot of times they get their record completely clean and they get to go to a different police department. So the labor movement, and particularly the organized labor movement, needs to think about how it can use this power and its influence to change the fundamental role of police unions in this racist abuse of regular African American and brown people. I don't think that the labor movement is even at the first step of that, because our leaders keep saying some of the same things that you just said, which is we shouldn't focus on the union, we should focus on the police. I don't see an alignment between the generation of leaders who are actually changing the country and the labor movement. So the labor movement just becomes irrelevant. That's the problem. But I don't want to take up too much more space. I want Mercedes. I know she has something to say as well.
Yeah, that's a lot. So I'll say this because Terrence, you mentioned, it's important that folks know the action piece, and the action is here. The demand is there. Like, folks really should not be confused when we say defund the police. It means reducing the size of the budget, their power, the size of themselves as an institution. And that institution surveils, police, punishes, incarcerates, and kills Black people. We want that to get to zero, not 75%, not 65%, not 2%. We want them to stop killing Black people. And the action behind that is investing in and building entirely new community infrastructures that will produce the genuine safety and sustainability that we need for our communities. And so we've all said this, but there's still this confusion around what we mean when we say defund the police. We're legitimately demanding, not asking anymore, we're demanding that we reimagine, that we take away that power, that we take away the money that they continue to take from our communities. Because if you ever look at a local city budget, you look at a state budget, anytime they increase the budget for the police, there's a divestment from public education. There's a divestment from job training. There's a divestment from local communities in an array of different ways, right? And so when we say this, we're having this conversation about, like, how do we bring power back to those that are powerless? When we talk about labor unions, how do we increase the power of Black workers, Asian workers, Latino workers, so forth? And when we think of police unions, we have to be honest about the ways that they operate. They advocate to be able to conduct violence in different ways. They don't ever show up and say, and have a press conference in the middle of a protest and say, what we witnessed, what we saw was not the institution of policing. Police unions are a blue wall of silence. And we see that constantly when Black people are killed, constantly. And what we're saying as young folks, especially to our movement elders, our labor elders, like, y'all, we have to be more honest about what's been happening in our communities. And this institution of policing came from slave catching. It is rooted in anti-Blackness. It is rooted in protecting property. It is rooted in protecting the elite. And when we talk about these bad apples, it's not that. It's not about individual acts of violence. It's about an institution that's rooted in violence towards Black people. And as young folks, I don't want to look up and be 60, 70, 75, and young folks are still talking about the need to defund the police and still fighting with labor leaders about the need for them to stop associating themselves with a group of folks, not even folks, with an institution that historically has been, actually, let me start here. The first institution, the first existing formation of policing was union busting in Boston. 1839, there's a book called The End of Policing by Alex Vattel that everyone should read.
Right.
And the institution of policing was union busting. It literally was rooted in stripping power away from workers. And so for us to think that they're not doing that today, it's on camera, it's in the papers, it's in our own, labor unions, right? Like, it's very clear. And so it's important for us to be honest about the fact that, yeah, there may be some good cops. Some of them may be our family members. But the institution of it itself does not breed the things that we wish that it does. It does not keep us safe. And our whole message is that we keep ourselves safe. And the ways that we keep ourselves safe are alternatives outside of the police. And it's important for folks to understand that and to recognize that we do have demands, we do have an action, and it's causing folks to be more honest about the institutions that we've been living under for centuries.
Yeah, let me just, we've got to move on. I know Kimberly has something else she wants to say on this, but we're going to move on because we're going to run out of time soon, and we're supposed to do a few more questions, but this is something that I thought was important. The point that I want to make here is, what I've been trying to make is, what I'm trying to do is to open up a intergenerational conversation. And the conversation has to go both ways. And that's what I'm trying to propose, is that the conversation goes both ways. And I just need the three of you younger folks, because as I said before we got on the thing, I think all of you are around the age of my children. I need you to understand that when we hear things, just like when you hear older people say things, you go, what the heck are they talking about? There's times when we hear defund the police, we're like, whoa, wait a minute, we can't have that. That's gonna be, yeah. It's probably terminology, because I think in some cases we're saying the same thing. We need to reevaluate the budget as to where funding is going and make sure the funding is going where it needs to go. But when older people hear, and older people, my age and older, initially hear defund the police, they freak. And that's what I want you to understand is don't get upset because the old people freak at what you're saying. Explain to them what you're saying. And you know what? Sometimes you're going to have to explain it more than one time, just like sometimes we have to explain to you more than one time what we're trying to say. So let's just be open and open that line of communications. Kim, you had something to say, and then we're going to try to get another piece in.
Actually, President Melvin, you kind of bumped to what I'm saying. I think it's funny that it's an intergenerational piece when you got to think about the fact that, and I'm going to just pull the name that I'm most familiar with, Angela Davis has been having conversations and talking about abolishing the police since the 70s, right? So it's actually people from your generation who've imparted that wisdom to us. And I actually just recently watched a talk with her where she was talking about this is decades in the making, where it finally bumped into a generation and several conditions that made this conversation viable, that made us actively want to reimagine the way we live our lives. There has been so much discourse on social media between the 8 to reform kind of movement that D-Ray and then we're pushing out, and then the 8 to abolition. And the idea that we should be having an abolitionist mindset. And the reason why is because the more extreme you become with your demands, the more likely you're going to reach those levels of extremity. If we just say very simply to defund the police, what we're going to get is reforms like we have been. But if we say abolish the police, what we're going to start to see is defunding. I actually don't think it's a terminology issue. I think it may be a conditioning issue where people have been conditioned in this way of life, dealing with safety, their personal protection, when the reality is, to go to an extreme, less than 2% of rapists actually see jail time, right? So those are extremes. The most people who see jail time are Black and brown people for nonviolent offenses. And so I think if we move from those extreme ideas of violence to go to what is actually denoted as criminal, you can see there's no reason why we should be giving a police department a tank. They don't need it.
I don't think anybody.
Really quickly, to your point around education, our coalition in Dallas, it's called In Defense of Black Lives Dallas, is multiracial. UIP 100 Mothers Against Police Brutality, a number of folks bottom lining and moving to work in our city are doing the work of education. So I don't spend as much time at Zoom. I actually am so over the Zoom working class. But through this pandemic, we are having conversations about not only what defund the police means, but also what it looks like to actually extract that money from the police department's budget and to put that back into the community. And so we're doing that through a series of teach-ins, popular education in the streets, and also transforming that into people's assemblies, which came from the Malcolm X grassroots project movement in Jackson, Mississippi. And so we have the honor of bringing that sort of organizing tool to our own community, and we get to have a conversation about what would you do with $100 million? What would it look like to create that type of safety in your community? And for us to present a people's budget in August, which is when our city council decides on the budget. Well, they view it first, and then in September, October, they actually decide that. But I am definitely of the understanding that, folks are gonna arrive to this moment. Like I just came into this framework just 4 years ago, right? Before then, I absolutely believed that police kept us safe, and never understood the cognitive dissonance to see them killing us at the rate that they were, and then to tell myself that they still keep us safe. And so I am definitely patient and understand that our folks aren't just coming to this moment and saying, I get it now. But there are people that are, and we're training them, and they're joining us in this movement. And we're educating our folks. And so I just wanted to name that there are folks around the country right now that are not only pushing these demands, but are also bringing their folks along in this conversation and making sure that we arrive to the same conclusion and understanding, because our folks know it. Once you present the facts, like everyone makes the connection, right? Like it's not that we're talking at our people. It is very much so like in conversation. and being honest about this moment and where we want to go and what we want to build together.
All right, thanks. Let me, we are quickly running out of time, and I had a whole list of questions I wanted to ask, and y'all just like took over, like you always do. Anyway, thank you for the conversation. I just want to end on this note, though, and give everybody a minute or so to respond to this. I believe, and this is me, that we change this country by changing who the leaders are in this country. And there is a question about what's going to happen in November in this country. And, we got polls showing that, older Black folks are going to go with Joe, and the white men are going with the orange man. White women are kind of in the middle right now. It's the young Black folks. The men are most of the men are Black men are with Joe. The young Black folks ain't quite sure where y'all going. So my question as we wrap this up is, why should you? Are you going to vote in November, and why? Yes or no? For each one of you, if you could just take a minute or so to answer that as we come.
Yeah. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I work for a political party. We are a grassroots third political party in this country. And for me, I have always been committed to the understanding of political power at the table and taking seize and hold of that as a community. So for me, I will be voting this fall, but I will be voting on the merits and issues that impact me, myself, and the folks that I'm organizing locally in the city of Dallas and Texas. And so for me, what's most important is the down ballot. I recognize and understand how the president influences much that happens, but I also know that the issues that are closest to my people are those who are running for U.S. Senate, who are running for state Senate, for state House, and for these local seats within our cities. And so for me, much of the organizing that I'll be doing around this November election will be about the issues, in particular, candidates that align with WFP's model and our values, and recognize that Trump cannot be in office. And so I'm going to be honest about that, understanding that I wish that we had better options, but my goal, and I know within WFP, is that we will create a political terrain and landscape that allows us to not have to choose from the lesser of two evils in the next presidential cycle. So for me, again, I'll be voting and I'll be organizing my community to get out to vote as well, because 45 cannot remain in office for another 4 years.
Thank you so much. Larry or Kim?
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden isn't really a good candidate. Let's be honest, right? He didn't have much momentum behind him. There's questions about his acuity, which they may be ageist or whatever, but I do believe and understand the lesser two evils. I think most young people get that. We know that if Trump wins, he pushes us over the edge. So people will do it, but they won't do it with enthusiasm. It's kind of typical of the Democratic Party to push somebody like that at the front, because the fear of picking somebody too radical or something, and then losing to Trump again. But that kind of thinking is basically saying that we need to center white people and who they're more comfortable with, people in the swing states. In a way, Joe is kind of lucking out, because coronavirus and a lot of things have revealed the inadequacy of Trump to a degree that even a lot of white folks can't ignore. He's probably, there's a good chance he could win. If he does win, again, you're still going to have to really push him. And there's a good chance that people will be kind of confused by the fact that he's on the left and he stood next to President Obama and think that he's progressive, which he's not. He's actually pretty conservative. But yeah, I mean, if the question is, am I going to personally vote? Of course, I'm going to vote. But more than that, I'm going to organize, which is what I do anyway, because I don't have any faith in a person that supported, crime bills that put lots of Black people in prison. And I think that particularly older Black folks need to really kind of think hard about this and recognize that just because you like somebody doesn't mean that they're good for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Kim?
Yes, so personally, I'm going to unenthusiastically vote for Joe Biden. And what concern has actually become is mostly. And so what I'm hoping is that once Biden is elected and once we continue to organize, there are things that we'll be able to shift. I actually have a large issue with people developing policy for a future they won't see. And so I really want to continue to advocate for people my age and younger to actually run for public office. And so that's what I've actually been doing very recently, trying to get us in a position where we're actively organizing our own futures strategically.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me thank my guests for this evening, Mercedes, Larry, and Kim. They all work their busy schedules to be here with us tonight. Gave us a lot of food to think about, a lot of pushback. But I think this type of discussion is something that we need at the dinner table. We need it at the union halls. We need it at our churches. We need it at our community meetings. We really need to start really having a solid, open dialogue, intergenerational dialogue within our own community about what's needed and what's the best way to get it. Now, I personally think, as I said, that the best way to get it is to get the right people into office, elect the right people into office, and then once they're in office, give them our list of demands and hold them accountable for what they claimed that they were going to do when they get in there. We can't just elect people and leave them. We've got to elect them and hold them accountable. I think they gave us a lot to think about, a lot of work, things to work on, and honestly, a lot of motivation to keep this work up. I want to close out this episode by taking a moment to talk about the 2020 elections. Right now, we are seeing a spike in COVID-19 cases. We've seen politicians doxing their constituents to punish them for demanding police reform. We are finding out that Russia is putting bounties on American soldiers' head. The Attorney General wants to make fighting fascism a terrorist act, but not the KKK. All of this is due to the failure in leadership. From the president on down, this nation is riddled with inept politicians who are in positions way above their capacity. Governors like DeSantis in Florida are opening up their states up to the grim reaper for political points. This president and vice president are using the house of the Lord for photo ops and rallies. There are no adults driving in the driver's seat. Say what you will about Joe Biden. Say what you want about the Electoral College, but leadership matters. It matters when this country is surpassing 120,000 COVID deaths. It matters when American soldiers are killed by Taliban hitmen. It matters when there is an executive order protecting slave owner statues and not the descendants of slaves. Leadership matters. So does your vote. That ends our 4th episode of Laborship. I thank all of you for joining me. If you can, please visit our website at cbtu.org and donate to CBTU so we can continue to raise our voice against injustice and for a progressive shift